Good afternoon, everybody. So when Pranay, Pier, and I were discussing how should we structure this last session, uh, what we kind of zeroed in on very quickly is just to make this as practical as possible, talk about our real life experiences. What are the challenges that we face as we scale up data science, AI within our organizations? And in that context, Pierre, uh, you head data science at one of the largest firms which deals with extremely sensitive consumer data. What are some of the cultural and organizational challenges that data science teams face as they scale up AI and the use of AI within their organizations?
Yeah, there's a few challenges we have. I guess the biggest question is because we are sitting on a huge amount of transactional data, is what's the right thing to do with this data, right? Which go beyond of what's legal, what's GDPR compliance, what's privacy, is more in the space that Dan was talking about data ethics. I would like to distinguish between what's the usage of data for operational reasons toward anything else. So let me put things in perspective. So Visa globally process around 130 billion transactions per year, which is quite a significant number. And this happened also in a very fast time. So this morning at 9:31 p.m. I.m., we probably process in Europe around 3,000 transactions. So we do use artificial intelligence in this context to prevent fraud. And that's quite a kind of a safe place to be because everybody understands why we do that and everybody understands that it's important. We estimate that per year we save about $25 billion in fraud in the ecosystem, so that's good. It's all about balances. Anna this morning talked about all the dials and when you move one in one direction, what happens with the others. Of course, if you go in the morning and want to tap the card and pay for something, you want that transaction is going to be frictionless and it happens like relatively quickly. But in about 1 millisecond, we actually check that your transaction is safe and there is no fraud. Visa has been using artificial intelligence to prevent fraud since 1993. We used to use neural network for that context, and then we continue to develop. So this is an example where we feel really comfortable about, that's the right thing to do for the consumer, for the ecosystem, for everyone. Of course, when you sit on a huge amount of data, there's other things you can do, either in a commercial space or anything else. And in this context, everything becomes much more complicated because the question is, what's the right things to do with the data we can have access to? And then just getting all the balance right is the key. One specific example, which is quite current in today's environment, is about, within the context of data ethics, is about explicability. So I use an algorithm, I build an algorithm, but let me wear now my consumer hat. I would like to know if a company uses my data to make a decision about my financial life or anything. I would like to know why the outcome was yes or no, for argument's sake. Imagine I apply for a loan or a mortgage or whatever. And the more we use and we scale and we leverage artificial intelligence or advanced analytics in general to make those decisions, the more those decisions are basically get digitized, automatic, the machine learning about pattern and behavior. But I do have an accountability, I do have a responsibility toward the rest of the world. I can't just say, computer said yes, computer said no. I need to be able to explain why things happen in a certain way or in another. And when we talk with, you were mentioning about some of the cultural challenges. When we work with the team of data scientists, of course, they have a problem to solve. And sometimes the more you want to put power behind the algorithm, the less you're able to explain how the outcome has been generated. And therefore, where do you draw the line? This is just an example where you constantly need to think about how do I balance the power of the algorithm versus my appetite to kind of express or explain to the consumer or to the client how the outcome come out for.
Got it.
But it's all about getting all those balances right in order to do the right things for the consumer and for the clients.
Sure. Thanks, Peter. So Pranay, and in your role as you work across multiple clients and multiple industries, how do you see firms addressing these challenges?
Yeah. So, if you look at the issue of scaling and using AI effectively across the organization, you can think of a few dimensions, right? One is, what is the right thing to do from a company's perspective? Pierre also spoke about what's the right thing to do from the standpoint of the consumer. And then there is the question of what is our ability to do those things, right? I'll start with one example, and this was about a year back. We were invited to present at a client's internal conference. There were a few hundred people over there, 400 or 500 people over there. There were concurrent sessions. And the session that we were presenting at was titled AI something, right? And we had about 25 people signed up. There were 4 of us on the panel, 6 people were in the audience. Okay, so it was kind of, ego bruising in some way. So actually, I went to the door to see if we could get some people in, and I didn't manage to get anyone in, but a few very interesting observations. There were at least a couple of people who came up to the door, they saw the topic AI something, and they said something to the effect, I'm not intelligent enough for this session, and they walked away. Okay? And I'm reflecting on this and saying that I'm sure we're not saying that I'm not intelligent enough to understand how the engine works, so I won't sit in a car, right? Then why this idea about AI? And clearly, there were 2 things that came up. One is that AI is an intimidating term for most people, right? It is not well understood, and it is intimidating. And we have also created this big sort of aura, data scientist, these, geeks, extremely intelligent people, all of that kind of stuff. So within the organization, there is this sort of, AI literate versus AI not literate kind of thing, which dynamic which plays out. The second thing, which is probably more important, is just very simply, it's not about the focus on AI. It's about the focus on what it can do for you. Right? So what is the business question, right? And we said in the morning that you really have to frame the problem correctly. What is the right business question? And therefore, the focus needs to be on what are the opportunities, right? What are the opportunities and what are the problems that we can solve for, right? Now, the other thing is that there is a big difference between me as a consumer and me as a corporate citizen. Right? Because we keep saying that in our consumer world, we are able to use these products. Why are we not able to do it in the corporate world? It's because as a consumer, I'm only accountable to myself. What's the worst that'll happen if I use a product that doesn't work for me? I'll leave it. Right? But what can happen if I use AI to forecast demand and the product goes out of stock, sales drop? I might have to leave my job against my own wishes. Right? So there's a very different order of risk over there. And therefore, the need to understand the inner dynamics of the working, if I'm responsible for those decisions, becomes important because I need to place faith in that. Much as, if I'm boarding the car, I need to have faith that this thing won't explode on me, right? So, sort of similar, that's the kind of faith that people need to have. So both the ideas, which is, one is the idea of, what is the problem, what is the opportunity, and how can AI support that? And the second is that what are the risks and how can we prevent that, right? And therefore, in my observation, that CEOs who understand this dynamic well do a few things well. Okay, one is that I think they really elevate this topic, and they make it clear that there is tremendous opportunity. And not only is there opportunity, there is danger in not doing work over here, right? Because not doing is risky. We'll lose out to competition. That's one. I think the second thing that they do is that they elevate the function itself and celebrate that team, celebrate the leader, right? I've seen, people, CEOs say, okay, we brought this head in, this person, projected to the whole company and said, we're going to make this function successful for the company. But they also know that this is not enough because in the morning, as someone said, that, the CEO is the dictator, but not really, right? So then there is the aspect of making that function, that individual work with the rest of the organization, and then education and removing the fear around this, creating the sense of opportunity that becomes really important. So I think these are some of the aspects that the successful companies do well.
Sure. Makes sense, Pranay. And let me just pick up on that focus on business outcomes and how that's critical. So Pierre, as your team builds out these data science models, these large projects, in order to bring this business outcome perspective to that process, where do you get design thinking involved? Is it in the development phase? Is it in the deployment phase? How do you infuse design thinking into that entire process?
We try to integrate into the design as many elements as possible. So one of the challenges to have everybody connected and having a business problem to solve, understanding the needs of the data scientist, understand what's the right things to do with the data. And of course now, my biggest passion is around data ethics and how do we incorporate those elements into the design as well. So what we try to do high level is to include all those elements as much as we can into the same design, so into the same experience. But just to be a little bit more specific, data ethics by design is where we're spending a lot of time at the moment. And the reason why we do this is because imagine you can develop a product or a solution, and then you make sure it works, but then you need to be free of bias, you need to make sure that the outcome is fair, there is no discrimination, etc. So you can produce the outcome, you can produce the product and the solution and then test it. It's quite inefficient, at least for us. In some specific example, we built the product in 4 months, to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, but then it took us 7 months to test it against bias, discrimination, and fairness. It's not really efficient in the way you engineer the whole solution. So now what we're trying to think about is how do we include all those elements into the design of the algorithm itself. Now, when we look at some facts and data, we find a lot of fascinating things, right? Think about the first facial recognition algorithm. We look at that and a little bit of the history of what happened. The first algorithm developed by a famous company, they had a success rate to recognize a white male that was 100%. But if you were asking the algorithm to recognize a black woman, the error was around 31%. So we started to look at why this is happening and who was coding those things, who was training those algorithms. And we look at 3 different companies, guess in your mind how many black people were part of the developing community. Well, the answer was in the 3 companies was 1%. If you were looking about the population of people who were coding, how many female were there? One company was 17, the other was 19. So because part of the team is how to scale it, how to make sure that if you do something wrong, it doesn't scale accordingly, is how do you bring those elements into the design? And what we find particularly successful in our team is, we're a strong believer in diversity and inclusion as part of how we build the team. Because then every developer bring into the design a different perspective. What was quite interesting for us as a team is we have a person which is a data scientist with disabilities. And it's unbelievable how he helped the rest of the team to look at the problem from a different perspective and make sure that the outcome is also including his point of view and representing a part of the population that normally you would probably don't think naturally about how to solve specific problems. And so we try to bring all the elements that we believe are the right one into the design, but also making sure that the people that develop the solution represent those different angles. Because then those are the ones that code, those are the ones that train the algorithm, and the algorithm learn based on what you give them to learn, right? And so it's very important that when you design solution and scale it, you really think hard about, to Anna's point this morning, what can possibly go wrong and what you're missing behind, and try to almost by design eliminate those bias and those discrimination or elements that are not fair by any mean into the design itself.
That's pretty amazing, by the way, Pierre. So, Pranay, do you see similar acceptance of design thinking across other firms and industries?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to say that this is a very, this is an amazing take on design itself, right? That how do I design the team, right? How do I design the team to make the outcome really successful? And there is representation and participation by multiple stakeholders who will eventually experience the outcome, right? So representation, that's a really, really good way of thinking of design. In terms of your question on do we see adoption and acceptance of this, let me share one story from Fractal's history. A very large retailer called us in and asked us if we could create segmentation models for their do-it-yourself tools department. That's the department that sells screwdrivers and drills and stuff like that. And they wanted to create segmentation around, how much do people spend, how often do they buy in this category, and so on, much like your airline categories and stuff like that. And so the team on the ground sort of probed further. Why do you want to create this segmentation? Well, they said we want to increase our share in the marketplace. We want to sell more. And pushed a little further. So probably the best way to do that is to satisfy the customer needs better, right? And further conversation led to a very interesting insight that a very important dynamic in this category is the expertise level of the buyer. Are they an expert user of those, drills and screwdrivers and saws, etc., or are they just a novice or casual user of this product? Because that determined their behavior, that determined what products they wanted, what kind of service they wanted, and so on. So we together agreed that this is what we're going to do. Actually, we are now going to create a segmentation model that classifies consumers, buyers by their expertise level. And now this is where the AI came in. In the morning, we spoke about how AI today is good for very narrow functions. So this is an example of that. In this entire scheme of creating value from that DIY department of this retailer, AI played a very narrow role in terms of categorizing the customers, and it did a good job. And because of that, they were able to change their kind of promotions they did, the kind of products they stocked in the store, all of that, and they saw meaningful uplift in their sales, right? But now, if you think of this whole journey, there is was this worth doing as a starting point? Was this a good enough problem to solve for? First question. What kind of, we want to increase the sales, but what is the way? Segmentation, what kind of segmentation? Then once that segmentation is done, is it predictive enough? And then can we implement it at scale to do some meaningful intervention, right? So pretty large process. AI is playing a pretty small part in this entire journey, and value realization is not guaranteed. And because value realization is so hard is precisely the reason why design is so important. All of that conversation up front to truly understand the problem. Is this the right problem to solve? Are we solving it the right way? Are all the stakeholders represented in the conversation? And I think that's the reason why design becomes so important. Now, to answer your question, are companies using this effectively? The short answer is no. At the same time, there is increasing recognition for this, and we see a lot of companies start to think about this. And in our client base, we have seen that the companies that have effectively used design have had very, very successful results. So they have been able to create use cases that create value, that address customer needs, that have acceptance across the organizations, and that go into implementation and create value.
Cool.
But I'm sure that we will actually see tremendous expansion in this space.
Sure. It's an evolving journey, right? So these patterns will emerge. There will be increased adoption in the industry.
Yeah.
So now we have done design thinking. We have used great data science. Pierre, your team has now built this really good model, right, which is now to be deployed. You take it over to the production team. What are the challenges that these teams have to overcome as these models get deployed within enterprise IT systems on production systems?
Great question. As a data science team, what we do normally is work in the space of innovation and innovate with data. So thinking about the future, how to use transactional data in a much more powerful way. It's relatively new for a company like us. I mean, Visa, in particular, as I said, use artificial intelligence in Sever to solve specific problem like reduce frauds. But in the context of today's world, data science is relatively new. And there's a lot of clients, so our clients are normally other business, so we don't interact directly with consumer, but there's a lot of clients that want to solve for very interesting problem in a very creative way. A big team today is, a couple of big teams who are working on. One is sustainability, and the other one is helping vulnerable client to have a better life. Now, of course, everything is new. It's new for us. It's new for the industry. New for the consumer. It's new for the regulator. So the space we play is to prototype things, proof of concept, test it, debate it, share with regulators and government, and make sure that we're doing the right things, etc. But then, to your point, that if something works or we believe is going to work, how do you integrate with the production line? Well, that's a challenge. And the challenge is because most of those ideas, we generate ideas like on a regular basis. Most of them are going to die. Some of them are going to fly. How do you know? And I guess the real challenge is that the production line of a company that has been operating in a certain way for a number of years is quite robust, and there's quite a lot of governance around. And every time you innovate or you're trying to introduce something that is difficult or different, you almost need to stop the production line and say, give me a little bit of space for me to test it and see how I can scale it. But you don't have most of the answer, right? You don't know whether you're going to make money with it. You don't know whether, what's the consumer reaction, what's the client reaction, etc. So the way we're trying to solve this problem is essentially, well, first of all, we started to be much more open with API solution and working with client and work with partner that help us to deliver this in a different way. Particularly in the US, we just recently bought a company that help us to connect, for example, fintech, which already has a connection with most of the financial institution to our world and vice versa. But I guess, so we have a kind of a temporary solution to bring the idea from prototype, proof of concept to product. But I guess, most of the company, including us, need to, over time develop a fast track or a fast lane to be more agile in developing and testing those ideas in a faster way, I guess.
Yeah, and we are seeing that this pattern is evolving, where how do you stream in this innovation on an ongoing, in an agile manner into the production systems? And I'm sure this particular topic will start coming up in many of these discussions going forward.
There are companies that actually take away innovation from the core business to avoid that the core business kill innovation, or vice versa. Hopefully not, but yeah, we're still quite integrated, and we try to make it work.
Yeah.
So, but have you considered, or are you bringing in some of the production people into your team itself? People who can actually create the engineering around the deployment within the data science team? Is that something that you do?
We thought about it, but we chosen not to do for the moment, because actually we try to give more space for creativity, okay, and understand the art of possible, etc. Our production line and our product development team, as you can imagine, because of the scale of the financial institution we touch and the consumer we touch, they're super robust. And they go through a series of tests that we're not there yet as be ready to be more agile. But I think probably that's something is going to happen in the near future.
So thanks for sharing that, Abhi. As we look at customers, right? As we look at the eventual consumers of all the AI work that the firms are doing, there are AI applications like, let's say, shopping recommendations, which many customers like it. And then there are AI applications like retargeting ads, which some people find intrusive, right? So as the data science teams goes out and builds these models, what are the institutional mechanisms, the checks and balances that you have to ensure that you're doing the right thing for the customer?
Well, it's a great question. Is my biggest area of focus at the moment, which is what I call data ethics, but it's quite wide. So because we are a data-driven team, we started with something very basic, which is asking people what they think about it. So last year we ran a couple of campaigns, one in the UK and the other one in the US, with like interviewing people on the street with cookies and drinks. And we ask a lot of questions about how do you feel about company like us and others using your data or having access to your data or knowing something about you. And we ask quite a lot of questions to quite a lot of people. So I believe I have a good understanding of what the challenges are. But in essence, about 2/3 of the people we interviewed, they are concerned. And then we started to understand what they are concerned about. And the majority of the reason of people raising the hand was about frauds, identity frauds, and all this kind of stuff. But there's other like 20 reasons why people are not happy for a company to use their data. One in particular was, to your point, is it feels like too much intrusive. Like the word today, I do something, and then after a while I receive an email that and that doesn't feel right. Particularly if company do it without me to be happy with it. The high-level summary is that imagine you segment this population from people that really understand what's going on in the world today in the data privacy. We call it privacy IQ, but it generally encapsulate all your understanding about company having access to your data, how do they use it, what do they do, how they make money, are they selling it, whatever. So imagine you rate them from I understand everything to I don't understand anything. Then the correlation that come with profiling those people are quite powerful. So generally speaking, younger generation, they have a better understanding than others. They are more, the people that understand it better are normally tech savvy, or well, that's obvious. And what happens is that the more they know and the more they understand, the more they demand control. So imagine you want like almost a dashboard and say, okay, you're going to use my data to this, no, this, yeah, maybe in the middle, this. And the more you get control available, the more you relax, right? Because you feel like you are in charge and you feel like you can control that. So we did ask a lot of questions. We did develop our own insight. And then we develop our own data ethical principle, which include different elements, but not in a particular order. Transparency is one of my favorite. And by transparency, I mean, I really need to make sure that whatever we develop, a client or a consumer, in 3 words, understand what we do or what we don't do with it. It's not about giving them like 300 pages of terms and conditions. Yeah. Well, actually, you missed the point on page 258, right? The government recently did a study to understand how long does it take for a consumer to tick the box on terms and conditions, and on average is less than 2 seconds, which means nobody read them. And therefore, if nobody read them, GDPR, etc., is becoming a little bit, less relevant. Yeah. So I feel that the responsibility to understand and to make sure that the consumer understands what's going on is switching from the consumer to the company. I feel the responsibility to make sure that my client know exactly what's happening with the data we have access to. The other one, which is one of my favorite value, is one of my favorite principle is around sharing value. So now I'm wearing my consumer hat again. If I know that someone is using my data, and with those data they are getting some sort of economical benefit, I want a slice of it, right? Yep. Because it's kind of coming from my data. Or I want to get something back, so my life should be easier, Or shall I get, my favorite example is, because I drive in London, is this application called Waze, which basically is a social network, GPS, to help you to avoid all the congestion or pothole or whatever. And, I often give consent to use my data because the value that this app brings to me is, in my mind, is higher than the perceived risk of them using my data by getting something back. If I will need to deal with a company that only use my data because they sell it to someone else for marketing perspective or whatever, then I won't be happy. And or maybe I want to make sure that I'm able to decide and get something back. Of course, security is self-explanatory. Accountability is another important area for us, to make sure that the consumer and the client are comfortable that even if we use AI or advanced analytics or machine learning, whatever, we just don't say, it was the machine that made the decision, right? So I can use the tool to help me to be faster, and I can use the tool to make sure that the consistency is driven around a huge number of decisions, but I'm still responsible for the outcome, so I cannot blame the machine or I cannot blame the algorithm, so I'm still accountable for that.
Sure.
And so, in essence, we've been developing those principles. Is not something that is static. It continues to evolve because the world evolves and the consumer gets a better understanding about what's going on, and so we keep evolving those in.
And it's interesting to see how much teams, data science teams, design teams, they're investing in this whole customer behavior understanding and the ethics around using the data. And Pranay, do you see a similar pattern across other industries, or do you see companies at different points along this customer-first AI maturity curve?
Yeah. So I think the way we frame the customer-first question here is, one is, of course, what benefits the customer might drive. So, are we creating better products and stuff like that? But I think most of the conversation right now is focused around the ethics of using the data and putting customer first in the longer term perspective, right? And it is certainly a topic, there's no question. And I think almost every client that we speak with, that we work with, they all are, very strong norms around data privacy, data protection, data security, and a fair amount of conversation around what is the right way to use the data and what is not the right way to use the data. There is, however, this thing about what is right for the business and what seems right for the customer, at least now, versus what is truly right for the customer in the longer term, right? Shrikant mentioned this morning that Netflix is saying that sleep is my number one competitor. And the thing is that with the amount of data that companies have today and the tremendous algorithms that are available, they do have a significant amount of power. It's unprecedented amount of power in understanding the customer deeply and understanding many aspects of them better than the customers understand themselves, right? So yes, I think through the algorithms and by making the recommendations, it is entirely possible that an organization may be able to systematically cut into some of your sleep, and over a longer term, that's going to have an impact on you. Or, my immediate gratification from shopping versus my, financial security, right? Or the benefits of, preventing crime or catching crime using facial recognition versus my liberty to protest without being recognized and databased by the government, right? So these are all questions that are out there, and how we deal with them, I think that's a question. I mean, that's a big question. So again, it was great to hear early in the morning that, as an example, Amazon has a customer advocate in every meeting, and they're thinking about things from the customer's lens and the customer's hat. And I think companies have a responsibility, and I think companies, will certainly create this sort of, function or have people who represent that point of view. That cannot be our only source of managing this issue of what is right for the customer, right? I mean, just on the financial side, we have internal audits, but for good reason, we have external audits, right? We don't say that self-regulate your financials and we'll all be fine with that, correct? And I do believe that governments have a strong role to play in that, and the government role will be critically dependent upon how vocal we as consumers and citizens are on this topic, right? So if it becomes a big enough topic for us to raise it with governments, governments will work with it. Which is not to say that governments don't do things proactively, but clearly there is this big incentive around, what does my constituency, what do my voters want, right? So it's great to see that, Europe has taken steps in this direction. I think US is certainly, highly undecided on this topic, and US is moving towards, right, at this point of time, the trend is towards more deregulation, whether it's, competition or, other aspects of regulation. But my belief on this is very strong that if we want data to be used correctly, and if we want true long-term, good of the customer, what is right for the customer, there will have to be, oversight through citizen bodies and through governments.
Got it. So I think it's a great cover of all the key items. How do we scale up AI and design using engineering and keeping customer interests front and center? Just want to check any questions from the audience.
Yeah, this is your last chance to ask questions today. So if you've got a burning query that you've been keeping to yourself, but now's your time to put your hand up and ask that question. So could I ask anyone who's got a question to put their hand up now? Surely somebody here has got a question that they want to ask. Otherwise, it's going to be me again. Just over here, if we could bring the microphone to this gentleman, please.
Thank you. So there's a question for the panel here. So to make workable solutions and solve problems at scale, right, we need some enablers in place. So do you think the way the capability teams are structured within an organization have some role to play in the way the collaboration happens? If yes, is there any ideal recipe that should be followed while organizations think of leveraging these capabilities to solve business problems at scale?
You mean from an organizational perspective?
Absolutely.
Maybe?
The way the org structure is made, the teams are isolated versus centralized versus decentralized, that kind of a...
Well, I guess it depends on the company, on the industry. What I see the most is that the answer is not really, but I guess depends. So, for example, part of the challenge is in the financial industry specifically, because of, particularly in Europe, there's quite a huge amount of regulation that it's helpful because it helps us to kind of think hard to do the right things and to make sure that we don't do damages to the ecosystem. When you scale a solution, there's a huge amount of area that you need to go through and test and check, etc. And that's often what I see, not within the organization I work for, but within the client's organization, that often is a barrier to scale it. It's a barrier in terms of connecting the dots between the different functions. Is a barrier in terms of speed to scale, because I guess, and speed is probably my key concern, right? Because some of the solutions that we can come up today, they're quite relevant if you solve for that in the next 2 or 3 months. But often, when you need to develop at scale those solutions, you're talking about 2 or 3 years. So by the time you complete the project, almost you deliver something that is not relevant anymore. In other area or in other industries, sometimes it's easier, but of course, when it's easier, it's also a little bit riskier, because then, of course, when you have all this flexibility and this independence to create something, scale it, etc., then it's often when something goes wrong, because you want to do it fast, you want to do it at scale, you want to be the first one, get the advantage of being the innovator in the market, etc. And if you don't have enough control in place and enough robust processes, then when you introduce a little mistake or a little problem into the system, then you also scale that. So I guess, my personal view on this in the industry, we will get there, but we are not there yet, or at least where we should be.
Quick point on this. I mean, given the need for speed, given the realization that we need a multidisciplinary team, and that really understanding what the customer wants, what the business goals are, all of that together. So there needs to be a team that represents many dimensions to the problem. We're starting to see a trend, at least in some industries, where the function is moving into the business, closer and closer into the business. Whether that business is organized by product lines or that business is organized regionally, we're starting to see that initially these companies might have built a lot of capability centrally, but now are starting to diffuse them into infuse them into the business lines. Yeah.
And any other questions?
There's one question.
Over here, please. If we can bring the microphone over here. Pass the microphone. Here we go.
What's your experience of factoring in the unknown unknowns, the black swans in the decision making and the field of AI? Because most of it is based on historic training data or test data. So how do you bring in the unknown unknowns into the decision making part of this modeling or AI?
So you mean when you test something new or something that
that we are not even aware of that could derail us in the future? So the classic black swan events like the 2008
Yeah,
crash.
so the way we think about innovating with data in general is again, it's down to the structure of the team. So we decided to structure the team with kind of an internal focus part of the organization that play safe on strategic decision, helping the business to do the right things and shooting in the right direction, sort of things. We have another part of the team that work in the space of the relatively known, so with client to deliver off-the-shelf solution or to work on teams that we feel relatively comfortable about what we're going to do. Then we have other two teams, right? And they play like the accelerator and the brake of the machine. One is research and development, which job is essentially to push the boundaries, think about how far you can go with a simple transactional data when you have billions of them, and discovering the unknown. And this team works in a very particular way. So there's a lot of interaction with other industry. Like we are quite passionate about cross-industry best practice sharing. So we talk to Formula One team to understand how they use data science to solve problems, just to learn from each other. We partner with university, we work with charity, we work with everybody that has a passion in that space. And particularly on Friday is normally the day that we dedicate to crazy idea and come up with something that, can we save the planet with Visa transactional data, reducing CO2 emission, right? And well, in this case, the answer was yes, by the way, but we didn't know that, right? So it was almost like the team moving into a space of how can we just try to address the most unknown area. Can we help people with mental health to have a better financial life and move around the city and make payments in a controlled way? Plus a lot of other things. So that's the accelerator, research and development. And then there's another department which is basically 100% focused on data ethics and thinking hard. So they're not data scientists. There's a mix of people that has a legal background or specialized in politics or external affairs, and they do a lot of lobby and interaction with government, policymaker, regulator. And that's kind of what I call the brake, but it's a safety device, because when we start to play with the art of possible and think in the space of research and development, how far we can go, what are the problems we can solve for the good and the great, then we normally share it with someone that has, to your point before, the industry cannot self-regulate itself, right? So you need someone else that can tell you, maybe, yeah, you try to solve the right problem, but think about this and think about that. And that's part of the design of our data science lab. Every company will have a different view, but it is all about kind of giving the ability and the flexibility and the space for people to create new things and explore, but in a controlled way. So you use like in the lab, and then you test it with consumer, with client, with regulator, with government, and then if there is something that makes sense, you build it up and you move eventually to production. Does this answer the question?
And Pranay, do you have any thoughts as well about dealing with the black swan?
My thought is that I guess we should not expect data and algorithm to do everything for us, right? So I guess there are lots of things that will fall in the realm of brainstorming, as you said, your Friday afternoon brainstorming sessions and things such as those. So, yep.
Thank you very much to our panel. A round of applause for them, please.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.